The summer of 1969, it felt different. You could feel it in the air. It wasn't just the humidity, that thick, sticky blanket that settled over the suburbs and the cities. It was something else, a tension. The world, it seemed, was fraying at the edges. On the glowing blue-gray light of the television, Walter Cronkite's steady voice counted the casualties in a place called Vietnam. In the streets, the music was loud, Creedence and Hendrix and Joplin, a soundtrack of protest and frustration. We were a nation divided, shouting at ourselves. The headlines were filled with shadows. It was the summer of Woodstock, yes, but it was also a summer of deep anxiety. The American dream felt complicated, tired even. And yet, above all that noise, above the smog and the anger and the headlines, we were all, quietly, looking in one direction, up. We were looking at the moon. It hung up there in the dark, pale and silent. It was the same moon our grandfathers had looked at, the same one from nursery rhymes. But that summer, it felt different. It wasn't just a light in the sky. It was a destination. It was the only clean, quiet, hopeful thing in a very loud world. And we had promised ourselves we would go there. To understand the moon, you first have to understand the fear. It began 12 years earlier, October 4th, 1957. Back then, America was comfortable. We were the winners. We had the shiny new Chevrolets with the big fins, the kitchens full of new gadgets, the suburban lawns that looked like green carpets. We were the future. The skies belonged to us. And then, one cold night, a sound. Beep, beep, beep. It came from a small metal sphere, no bigger than a beach ball. It was hurtling over our heads 18,000 miles an hour. And it wasn't ours. It was Russian. They called it Sputnik. The shock wasn't just that they had done it. It was that they had done it first. That little orbiting beep was the sound of our confidence shattering. Suddenly, the night sky wasn't just for lovers and poets. It was a frontier. It was a new, high ground, and we had just lost it. That little silver ball created a shadow, a fear that we were no longer the smartest, no longer the best, that our children were falling behind. That fear, that panic, that is truly what lit the rocket fuel. The space race wasn't just about exploration. It was a race to get our future back. The nation needed more than just a reaction. It needed a new direction. That direction came from a voice that was new, crisp, and full of vigor. John F. Kennedy. He didn't look or sound like the presidents of the past. He looked like the future. And on a sunny September day in 1962 at Rice University, he stood before the nation and pointed not to the horizon, but straight up. He gave a speech that still echoes today. It wasn't just a policy speech. It was poetry. It was a challenge. It was, frankly, an audacious gamble. "We choose to go to the moon," he said. His words hung in the air. He acknowledged the staggering difficulty, the enormous cost, the sheer impossibility of it all. And then he said that famous line, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because they are hard." In that moment, he changed the mission. It was no longer a race driven by fear. It was a quest driven by the best parts of the human spirit, courage, curiosity, and a defiant belief that we could build ladders to the stars. The promise was made. Now it had to be kept.
A promise is just words. To make it real, you need sweat, genius, and sacrifice. This wasn't just a government program. It became a national obsession. 400,000 people, engineers, scientists, mathematicians, test pilots, seamstresses, yes, seamstresses hand-stitching the spacesuits, poured their lives into this one single goal. They worked in smoky rooms filled with chalkboards. They invented new kinds of mathematics. They built computers that were less powerful than the phone in your pocket today, but they guided men through the heavens. But the dream had a terrible price. January 27th, 1967. Apollo 1. A fire. A routine test on the launch pad. 3 men, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, were lost before they ever left the ground. The nation was shattered. The program almost died. For a moment, the moon seemed too far, the cost too high. But their sacrifice was not in vain. It was a tragic, terrible lesson. Out of those ashes, NASA rebuilt. They made the ships safer. They worked with a renewed, solemn purpose. They weren't just doing it for Kennedy's promise anymore. They were doing it for Gus, Ed, and Roger. So who do you send on a mission like this? You don't send poets or dreamers. You send professionals. Men who were calm under pressure. Men who were engineers and pilots first, and celebrities never. First, the commander, Neil Armstrong. Quiet, thoughtful. A brilliant engineer from Ohio who had already faced death in the skies as a test pilot. He was the man with the steady hand, the low pulse. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight. In fact, he seemed to actively avoid it. He was chosen because he was trusted. Then, the lunar module pilot, Buzz Aldrin. A brilliant mind, a PhD from MIT. He was the passionate one, the intellectual. He figured out the complex math of how to rendezvous in space. If Armstrong was the steady hand, Aldrin was the restless, probing brain. And finally, the command module pilot, Michael Collins. History often forgets him, but he had perhaps the most difficult job of all. While Neil and Buzz descended to the surface, Michael had to stay behind. He would orbit the moon alone, a single crucial link. If his systems failed, they would all be lost. He was, as he would later be called, the loneliest man in the universe. 3 very different men, a quiet leader, a brilliant scientist, and a steadfast pilot. They were the ones chosen to carry the hopes of the world on their shoulders. You can't just go to the moon. You have to escape Earth first. To do that, you need to fight a giant. You need to fight gravity. And to fight a giant, you need a giant of your own. Ours was called the Saturn V.
It's hard to describe the scale of this thing. It wasn't just a rocket. It was a building. It stood 36 stories tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It was a cathedral of aluminum, steel, and fuel, built by human hands. When it lay on its side in the assembly building, people said it was like a skyscraper had fallen over. It was the most powerful machine humanity had ever created. Period. It wasn't elegant. It was brute force. It was 3 stages of controlled explosions, all designed for one single violent purpose: to tear itself free from the grip of our planet. To stand near it, you could feel it. The sheer weight of the ambition. It was the physical manifestation of Kennedy's promise. It was awesome, in the truest, most terrifying sense of the word. And in just a few days, 3 men would be sitting on the very tip of that explosive candle.
1 million people had come. They camped on beaches, parked on the sides of highways, balanced on the roofs of their station wagons. They brought coolers and lawn chairs and transistor radios. It wasn't just a news event. It was the happening of the century. The air was thick with salt, mosquito repellent, and anticipation. Inside the Kennedy Space Center, the mood was different. It was calm, focused. Hundreds of engineers in white shirts and skinny black ties sat at their consoles, a sea of quiet concentration. And high above them, Armstrong, Aldrin, and Collins lay on their backs, strapped into their seats. The final countdown began. The voice over the loudspeakers, the famous voice of Apollo, Jack King. T-minus 60 seconds and counting. The whole world was holding its breath. In living rooms, in bars, in town squares, humanity was united, listening to that one voice. 12, 11, 10, 9, ignition sequence start. A rumble, a flash of orange light. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the giant rose. The sound hit the crowds not as a noise, but as a physical force, a shockwave that pounded their chests. People were weeping, not knowing why. The Saturn V climbed, a fiery star against the blue morning sky, carrying 3 men and the dreams of a species towards the heavens. The violence of the launch was over. Now there was silence. For 3 days, the crew of Apollo 11 drifted through the black. Their world was now the Columbia, the command module, a space about the size of a large car. It was a strange new life. They floated rather than walked. They ate food squeezed from packets. They watched the clock, performed system checks, and they looked out the window. And what a view it was! Behind them, Earth, it shrank every hour, from a giant living globe to a continental map, to a beautiful, fragile blue and white marble hanging in an infinite blackness. Armstrong said it was the most beautiful, most precious thing. There were no borders, no signs of conflict, just home, a tiny, perfect jewel. Ahead of them, the moon. It grew. No longer a romantic light, it became a place,
a world in its own right, gray, ancient, and pockmarked with craters. They were in the in-between, too far from Earth to be saved, too far from the moon to have arrived. Just 3 men in a tiny can crossing the dark. On the 4th day, they arrived. They slipped into orbit around the moon. Now the most delicate part began. Neil and Buzz moved from the command module through a tiny tunnel into the lunar module, the Eagle. It was a strange, fragile-looking craft, all sharp angles, foil, and spindly legs. They undocked. "The Eagle has wings," Armstrong said, and Michael Collins watched them go. He stayed behind in Columbia, their mothership, their only ride home. His job, to circle the moon over and over, while his friends made history below. Every time his orbit took him around the dark side of the moon, he would lose all contact with Earth, all radio signals, all telemetry, everything. For 48 minutes at a time, he was utterly, completely alone. He was not just the loneliest man in the universe, he was the most isolated human being in all of history. He was 2,000 miles from his crew and 240,000 miles from his species. He later wrote that he felt fine. He felt a part of it. He was focused on his checklists. He knew that if he failed, if his engine didn't fire to bring them home, Eagle would just be a monument. He was the lifeline, and he held.
The Eagle was falling. This was the most dangerous part. The descent was supposed to be automatic. The computer would handle it. But this was 1969. The computer had about as much processing power as a modern calculator. As they dropped toward the surface, alarms suddenly blared in the tiny cockpit. 1202! 1202! The computer was overloaded. It was trying to do too much at once. It was failing. On Earth, hearts stopped. But in the cockpit, Neil Armstrong was calm. His heart rate, famously, barely rose. He looked out the window. The computer was trying to land them in a boulder field, a field of rocks, some as big as a car, that would tear the fragile lander to shreds. He did what he was trained to do. He took control. With one hand on the joystick, Armstrong manually flew the Eagle. He was flying a craft that had never been flown this way before, in an environment with no air. Buzz Aldrin, next to him, read out the data. 40 feet, 20 feet, picking up some dust. Back in Houston, a voice from Mission Control crackled. 30 seconds. It wasn't a time update. It was a warning. They had 30 seconds of fuel left. If they didn't land in 30 seconds, they would have to abort or crash. Armstrong scanned, found a clear spot. 10 seconds. He eased it down, gently, gently. And then, silence. The rockets stopped. The alarms stopped. The shouting from Houston stopped. In the cockpit, there was just the quiet hiss of the radio and the sound of 2 men breathing. A small blue light on the console lit up. They were down. Armstrong keyed his mic. His voice was utterly calm, professional. He didn't shout. He didn't celebrate. He just reported. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. In Houston, The flight director, Gene Kranz, put his hands on his hips and let out a breath he'd been holding for 12 minutes. The room, silent with tension, erupted. Men in white shirts hugged, they cried, they lit cigars. But the most famous voice was that of the Capcom, Charlie Duke, on the radio back to the crew. You can hear the relief, the joy trembling in his voice as he tried to stay professional. "Roger, Tranquility, we copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot." They had done it. They were on the moon. They were safe. 6 hours later. The world was watching. 500 million, some say 600 million people. The largest television audience in history. They weren't watching a high-definition movie. They were watching a fuzzy, ghostly black and white image beamed 250,000 miles across space. The hatch opened. A bulky figure in a white suit, moving slowly, awkwardly. Neil Armstrong. He backed down the ladder, rung by rung. He paused. He was on the final step. And then he dropped down. His boot, a size 9.5, pressed into the fine, powdery dust of the lunar surface. For the first time in the 4-billion-year history of that world, a footprint appeared. He paused, and he spoke. The words he had thought about. The words that would define the 20th century. "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." History still argues if he said a man or just man. In the end, it doesn't matter. He was on the moon. We were on the moon. In that moment, everything that had divided us, the wars, the politics, the anger of 1969, it all just melted away. For one brief, shining moment, we weren't Americans or Russians or anything else. We were mankind, and we had done the impossible. So, what do you do once you're on the moon? You get to work. Buzz Aldrin joined Armstrong on the surface soon after, and as he looked around at the gray, silent landscape, he gave it a name that was, perhaps, even more poetic than Armstrong's line. He called it Magnificent Desolation. They were like two children in a brand-new, impossibly large sandbox. They practiced moving. They didn't walk, they bounced in the low gravity. They described the dust, which smelled, they said, like burnt gunpowder. They unveiled a small plaque on the leg of the lander. It read, "Here men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon. July 1969 A.D. We came in peace for all mankind." They planted the American flag, a moment of national pride, but one that was stiffened with a wire so it would fly in the vacuum of space. And then, the strangest part, they received a phone call from President Richard Nixon, from the Oval Office to the surface of the moon. It was a surreal, slightly awkward, but deeply historic moment. Then they did the science. They collected rocks. They set up experiments. They spent just 2.5 hours outside, but every second was history. Back on Earth, the planet was glued to the TV. In Times Square, the giant news tickers, which usually flashed stock prices or baseball scores, just said, "Man on Moon."
Crowds stood in the street staring up. In London, strangers gathered around television sets in shop windows. In Tokyo, families woke up in the middle of the night to watch. In Rome, the Pope prayed for the astronauts. Even in Moscow, the heart of the enemy, people were fascinated. And on American TV, the man who had been the voice of the nation's sorrows and joys, Walter Cronkite, was broadcasting. As he watched Armstrong step on to the surface, the veteran journalist, the most trusted man in America, was left speechless. He just smiled. He adjusted his glasses. He let out a little, whew, golly. He had no words, and in doing so, he spoke for everyone. For one night, it didn't matter who you were, where you lived, or what you believed. You were just human. And you were looking up at the sky, knowing that two of your own were up there. It was the most profound moment of shared experience in human history.
The job wasn't over. They had to come home. The Eagle blasted off from the moon, the only part of the ascent not filmed, and reconnected with a waiting Michael Collins. They jettisoned the lander, a tiny monument left behind, and began the long fall home. They splashed down in the Pacific Ocean, 3 heroes welcomed back to Earth. They were quarantined just in case of moon germs, but the world celebrated. Ticker tape parades, headlines of triumph. They were the biggest heroes on the planet. But the legacy, the nostalgia, isn't just about the parade. It's about the overview effect. The astronauts were the first to see our planet from the outside. They all came back changed. They came back with a message that our world is small, fragile, and the only one we have. The moon landing is nostalgia for a time when we did big things, when we dreamed not of the next phone, but of the next world. It's nostalgia for a time when the nation and even the world was united by a single positive goal. It's a memory of a summer night when we all looked up at the same moon and felt for a moment truly infinite. That is a feeling worth remembering.